So, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Can you hear me at that? Yeah. Excellent. So I don't need a microphone. My name's Scott King, and I'm the founder of the Built Environment Professionals Alumni Chapter. And I'm really delighted to welcome you here to the second event. And what I'm actually going to do is kick off this evening by taking a straw poll. Those of you who are for tall buildings, could you raise your hands, please? Okay. And obviously the rest of you who are against tall buildings, could you raise your hands?
Oh, bit of an uphill battle here.
Right, so let's see if you change minds by the end of tonight's debate. So folks, what I'd like to do is just say a few words about the Built Environment Professionals Alumni Chapter. It actually came into fruition in summer of 2014 when I was actually thinking that we really haven't been doing enough to bring together all of the wealth of experienced professionals that in some way are linked to London South Bank University. And if any of you want to get involved in helping us develop the chapter further, we have got a number of alumni members who will actually be circulating amongst us when we have drinks at the end of this session. There's a couple of things that I need to mention to you folks in terms of health and safety. If you hear the fire alarm go, you will see us all leaving by this exit fairly quickly. It won't be a false alarm. And the rest of you, if you want to leave at the back of the room and assemble on Keyworth Street. We have an architecture show every year at the university, which really showcases the work that our architecture students have been doing. And what I'd actually like to do is just show you a quick 2-minute video on that show. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, what I'd like to do now is just introduce 2 students to you, 2 of our current students. Monica, Aaron, if you'd like to join us. They are going to start the debate. They're going to say a few words for tall buildings and a few words against tall buildings. So, Monica, are we starting with you?
Yeah, I'll go. Hi everyone, I'm Monica, currently final year postgraduate at South Bank. I've just got a few ideas, thoughts about tall buildings in London and why I think it's a good idea that we go for it. So, we, as the next generation of architects, are in danger of becoming decorators. With the proposition of tall buildings in such a short time, it is our chance to challenge identity that the skyscrapers bring to our city and the ever-changing technology that allows us to build bigger and better. Tall buildings in London could mean technology for one, meaning change in the way we build forever, for instance the Shard, built extremely quick for the size because of the techniques. Identity, which could be another issue and, well, a good thing. A new statement to the world. We show that we're not afraid of change. improving surrounding conditions where there's no often clear absence of engagement. Streets could mean well maintained by a small footprint of tall buildings rather than a much bigger footprint of a ground scraper. Carry the identity into the future to ensure we pose questions of the individual's right to occupy public space rather than becoming absorbed by the architecture. Part of the London success has always been to embrace new and the change. Clearly, we're not afraid of change. That is what makes London what it is, after all. The future of tall buildings, rather than creating a cluster, is now our chance to create architecture which needs to be engaged, not only on the ground. Rather than becoming a symbol of a backdrop, a decorative element, or a metaphoric space, we have the opportunity to create buildings which bring the people together, leaving more ground level for the public, creating long-term effects in communities, and finally, creating engagement with the public. Like we see today in buildings such as the Barbican estate, for example, where buildings and spaces play complementary roles between private residency and the urban village, and most importantly, community.
Okay, well, I'm going to use the mic because it's a lot easier. Hello, my name's McDonald. I'm actually going to go against the masses in the room. I'm actually against tall buildings. And for me, it's not really necessarily the height of the building. It's what they actually represent in London at present and the fashion in which they're being designed. I think at the moment, on ground level, there's a lot more social issues to be dealt with. Most prevalent, the housing situation or the limited housing situation in London at the moment, and the increase in private rent prices. I find it quite disturbing that you have a lot of land and existing housing stock being used and demolished, and then putting, I mean, let's face it, these tall buildings are just luxury apartments in my view. We're not talking about the buildings that are in the city or the financial districts where they're more warranted. I think London's landscape across, you can look at places like the Carpenter's estate or around that area, the Haygate estate over the road and Nine Elms, where these are housing estates where they're just servicing luxury apartments that are unaffordable to 95% of London's population. And these 95% are actually what make London the place it is. Just as an example, I read an article today about Nine Elms, and the flats are now on sale. And they've got a 40-storey and a 60-storey, two skyscrapers, the latter being 200 metres tall, which is extremely large. And one bed flat there is £795,000, going up to £50 million for the penthouse. Now, I know these prices they're quite normal for London, but when you see them happening everywhere, but not servicing the housing need for the large population of London, I think there's something wrong with that. I'll just finish with I just think as architects we are problem solvers and we're creative thinkers, and I think if we actually just start thinking about the social issues at ground level and actually start servicing the masses and start getting the most out of design, we could actually start formulating some really interesting architecture. Thank you.
So, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce the chair of tonight's event, my colleague sitting to my left, Matthew Barac. I just want to tell you a few words about Matthew. Matthew, building on his professional practice experience in the UK and abroad, he brings an interest in the role of social responsibility in architecture in his teaching. Following over 2 years as a correspondent for the Architectural Review, he recently co-edited the magazine's first digital edition. His PhD, which tackled the role of architecture in shanty towns, won the Rees President's Award for Research, and I think that deserves a round of applause. And Matthew is also founding and trustee of a registered charity called A Little Private Practice My A-Level French, which I haven't done for about 30 years. Architecture Sans Frontières UK. Ladies and gentlemen, Matthew Barac.
Thanks very much, Scott, and thank you all for coming tonight, because it's raining and that always really puts a damper on these events. We've had lots of cancellations at the last minute, but it's also great to see that we had a lot of standbys and you all waited out in the queue for registration. So thank you very, very much for coming. I'd also like to say, because I know he has to go, thank you to Charles Egbu, our new Dean of the newly formed School of Built Environment and Architecture, for coming. Charles, over there. We restructured this year in the university, and it's really, we're all taking this as a fantastic opportunity to bring new energy to the activities that we host, and to events like tonight, which bring our alumni in for a much better give and take between the professional community, our old friends who we care for very much here at South Bank, and we are planning to do much more with you than we have done in the past. And also our colleagues across the different subject areas. So we're going to have some contributions from our distinguished speakers. I initially asked them to speak quite generally to this really nuanced questions of tall buildings in London, but actually what we've discovered more and more as we were sitting here chatting, that people have quite hardened views, and we even have quite hardened views. And I'm kind of hoping tonight that some of you will come with questions towards the end and express your own views, which are hopefully strongly felt. Aaron already raised a round of applause for some of his revolutionary ideas, and I'm sure we will have more. If people get very unruly, I've got something to shut you up here. And so if you hear that noise, that means you called foul. But do please save your questions for the end and come back to them, and we'll try to get as many questions and comments in. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, who is Peter Rees. Peter spent nearly 3 decades as chief planner for the City of London. He's widely credited as being really responsible for the skyline of that part of the city that we have today, and has had enormous influence more widely for the kind of rekindling of a love affair with tall buildings that we've had in London. About 20 new buildings under Ken Livingstone's mayoral leadership were given the go-ahead. Apparently some 200 under Boris Johnson, so what we see is Boris Johnson really has a very big appetite there. Peter is also, importantly here for all of you in the room, the alumni in particular, Peter is an LSBU alumnus. He graduated in 1982, and his career has seen him oversee, as I said, the dramatic change of the square mile, including the addition of the cheese grater, the walkie-talkie, and the Heron Tower. Happily, he's seen fit to bring his enormous experience and his inspiration and expertise from the world out there back to the Academy, and he is now Professor of Places and City Planning at University College, London. Peter.
Well, good evening. I'm going to start by letting you in on one of the secrets that we lecturers and professors have for assessing an audience. Now, we look very carefully at you to try and gauge how you're going to respond to what we say. And in 3 ways, assessing the audience is exactly the same as coming to terms with male impotence. No, it's true. The first thing you have to remember is that size isn't important. But I mean, you lot are really well hung, so I've no problem in that department. The next thing is that whether it's an audience or with male impotence, things only seem to work really well when you've got them in the palm of your hand. And thirdly, there's only one aim, and that's to try to achieve a standing ovation. Now that brings me on to tall buildings, because you could argue that tall buildings are architects masturbating. And in fact, there was a wonderful Hellman cartoon years ago in the AJ, with the setting was Hyde Park, and there was an elderly lady dragging a red-in-the-face, rather chubby policeman across the park, pointing incriminatingly at a man in a dirty mat lying on the grass, bearing a very close resemblance to Sir Basil Spence, and out of his loins were rising a model of the Hyde Park barracks, and he had his hand round it. And she said, "You can't let him do that there." And you could say that that really sums up building tall buildings. It's developers and architects with an insecurity complex, trying to produce a giant erection. And I always said to Irvine Seller, "Irvine, you've improved my sex life no end. When you built the Shard, my whole sex life changed. I happened to be renting a flat on the riverside in the city at the time, and every morning when I opened the curtains, the first thing I saw was a giant erection. Improved my life enormously. And Irvine now uses that joke in his own speeches. But when you look at it, what is the Shard? It's 3 buildings joined together to try to pretend Southwark is important. It is. It's Southwark trying to justify its existence, saying, look, we are the centre of London. Is there anybody in the audience that actually believes that? Because I don't. People used to say to me, what, is the Shard any good? And I said, well, yes, it's a very good sign. It tells you you're almost in the city. And Irvine says to me, he said, you secretly like the Shard, don't you? Sorry, you secretly like the Shard, don't you? And I said, no, Irvine, I don't like the Shard. And he says, well, he says, you're always coming up it, he said. And I said, yes, Irvine, I said, because it's the best place for me to see what I achieved in the city. That's why I like going up the Shard. So the Shard is the worst kind of tall building. It's trying to change the economic activity of an area by building tall. It didn't work at the London Bridge. Just outside, we've got the Strata. Who believes that's made the Elephant a better place? It's still an intersecting set of traffic gyratories that would make the Olympic symbol look poor in comparison. You can't find your way across the roads because of the traffic system that's here. And we're still surrounded by considerable amounts of deprivation and unemployment. The Stratas make no difference at all, even the 3 windmills on the top that never turn. And whoever thought that putting 3 windmills on top of a building that wasn't on a turntable would be a sensible way of creating electricity? Apparently, if all 3 went full pelt and the wind was blowing in just the right direction, you could power one of the elevators in the building. Greenwash. So the elephant is still the elephant, but it's now the elephant with an erection. Hasn't actually changed the place. Dubai. But Dubai's got the world's tallest building this week. So what? Next week, it'll be somewhere else. And then who's going to want to go and visit the world's 2nd tallest building? Now, there are exceptions. Manhattan, the Isle of Dogs, surrounded by water, very similar, limited land. Hong Kong, very little flat land to build on, lots of people to house, and I would suggest the City of London, just 1 square mile. In those areas and areas like them, there are more people who need to be in that location, want to be in that location, than can be accommodated at a low level. So the last resort is to build tall. And if you build tall, as they do in Manhattan, in Hong Kong, the City of London, then do it well. Get good architects in to produce distinctive buildings, produce gherkins, cheese graters, and what have you. And the fact that those buildings in the city got nicknames indicates that the public fell in love with them, because it's the public that, well, I nicknamed the cheese grater, but most of the buildings were nicknamed by the public. And that indicates the fact that they nickname them or use the nicknames indicates that they're actually falling in love with them and that they approve of them. But look at that crap all the way from Bermondsey to Battersea. Those high-rise piles of safe deposit boxes, those cling-filmed Chinese-owned apartments, what the hell are they doing for London? That's crapping on our skyline. And as far as I'm concerned, if that's tall buildings, we don't need it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. So the next speaker I'd like to invite up to speak is Mary Jane Rudy. Of course, for most of you, Mary Jane needs no introduction, but in fact, she's going to get one anyway. Excuse me. She is our great leader here at London South Bank. She's the subject leader for architecture. In that role, she oversees the whole of the architecture offer. She is also an architect and urban designer with a background in practice, and I'm going to invite her up to speak.
Okay, so I'd like to thank everyone for the opportunity of contributing to this debate. I think we're very well placed here to comment on this phenomena of high-rise. We're facing the city, we've got the front view, and we've got our back neighbourhood, which is Elephant and Castle. And firsthand, we can see some of the issues which relate to this kind of growing phenomena. So tonight, although I am liberal and progressive and do fundamentally enjoy high-rise, I'm going to vote to say, does London need more skyscrapers? No. Are tall buildings in London a giant mistake? Yes. And I know that the vote is stacked against us here tonight, but what I'd like to do is offer a contrarian view to invite you to say no, no to high-rise and the short-term profit ideology which lies behind them. I'm going to offer you two principles that you can use in this debate, and one is John Stuart Mill's harm principle. And the principle is a litmus test, I think, for this debate. Are these towers harming anyone? Are they doing more harm than good? That harm principle is a bit like the Hippocratic Oath, and it's useful in considering whether what is happening in London harms its citizens or is good for them. The Brundtland report, the classic definition of sustainable development is, of course, development which meets the needs of the present without compromising the needs of future generations. The second issue I'd like to raise is our right to the city. And I'm going to quote directly from David Harvey, who speaks about the right to the city and the right that we all have to the city. The quote I've got is really this: the question of what kind of city we want cannot be divorced from that of what kind of social ties, relationships to nature, lifestyles, technologies, and aesthetic values we desire. The right to the city is far more than the individual liberty to access human resources. It's a right to change ourselves by changing the city. It's moreover a common right rather than an individual right, since this transformation inevitably depends upon the exercise of a collective power to reshape the processes of urbanization. The freedom to make and remake our cities and ourselves is one of the most precious yet neglected human rights. So I'm just going to have a little talk now about that human right. Basically, what's happening at the moment in London, I would argue, we are in contravention of some of those basic human rights. And if we look, where's it gone? It's not moving. Sorry. Is that one okay? Yes. If we look at the proposal, and I know it's not a brilliantly drawn map here, we can see all of the new towers which are proposed under the Mayor's plan for London. And basically these towers are, you can see, clustered primarily quite close to where we all stand right now. And the reason for this is that the new plan for London has opened up development in a different way. It's identified areas of opportunity. And you might be pleased to note that the areas of opportunity where these clusters can begin to be developed are in Elephant and Castle, Deptford, Greenwich, Nine Elms has already been mentioned. So the city we can see up here, city in Canary Wharf, and it seems to me entirely appropriate that we have high-rise in the city and Canary Wharf. However, what we're seeing is a pepper potting of towers in these areas. And we've got to ask ourselves, why is this happening? It's happening because of our poor governance. It's happening because of legislation and government action, which means that our local boroughs and councils are poverty-stricken and have really no access to funding. What they are doing is negotiating with developers to get planning gain. And the maximum planning gain they can get is going to be used, of course, to support the schools and infrastructure that they so vitally need. Boroughs like Lewisham, Southwark, they're poor boroughs. They're boroughs which have already seen the erosion of an industrial base, and they haven't yet got a vibrant and strong service economy. So perhaps the issue here is that we're looking at a flawed system of governance where we're not taking sufficient responsibility for our city and for our environment and for our communities. We read about the debate, and I have to say the debate has been brilliantly covered by our journalists. The debate about the city, the debate about having access to the kind of information. This map was published not by the government. It was published by the newspapers and NLA, who are trying to expose the issues around this debate. So I'm just going to talk a little bit now about Policy 77, which is the Mayor's policy for the location and design of tall and large buildings. So there's nothing much wrong with the policy. If the policy was working, we would see this in our built environment. So tall and large buildings should be part of a plan-led approach, appropriate, sensitive, and appropriate to their locations, and they shouldn't have unacceptably harmful impact on their surroundings. So we're looking at the word harm. The word harm, that's what we're going to try and establish. So if we look at Elephant and Castle, we can see a really interesting set of junctions in the city. We see this high-rise building. We see the Haygate, the last stand. We know a little bit about this because as a school, we all visited the Haygate and we used it for a project last year. We've also done projects in this area. So what we're talking about is based on the experience of working in these neighbourhoods. We've seen how little this regeneration has benefited these communities at first hand. We know the cost of the flats. We know that a single bedroom flat, 2 bedrooms, is 700,000, not quite as expensive as 9 Elms. We also know that these flats have very high service charges, and we know that the people who lived in these blocks are not going to be living at Elephant and Castle. Most of them have moved on. There's only 77 socially rented apartments in the new development. Is that working for the communities in this area? I would argue strongly, no, it isn't. Just a good one of the demolition. And land and freedom. Columbia is not for sale, but the Haygate is. That's what the local residents see. That's what they think, and that's what they're aware of. So at the same time, we are incentivising, through our tax regime, large multinational companies to come to London. And I'm aware that investment is incredibly important. We all understand that London wants to compete to be a global city, but we've got to balance this equation. Towers, what are they doing? Are they integrating? Are they working to bring people together? I would argue that in many cases they are not. These residential towers that are being developed are in the most cases going to be enclaves for super rich, or they're going to be basically young professionals who will move in, high hopes, and as time goes on and the service charges increase and the cladding systems start to go, they're going to face very large service charges, and they may not be able to afford these. So I think what you're going to see is segregation between those communities and the towers. So on the harm principle, I think we need to make a stand. We need to actually say this isn't good enough. We have to look for different models of governance. We have to look for our politicians and our planners to work together. We have to understand that these rippling prices are a consequence of simply seeing property as a financial commodity. And everyone makes a buck around this, but it can't go on like this. So my proposal really is that we stop it and we think really long and hard about this. Not forever. Here we go, 9 Elms, a thing of great beauty. And the cluster, which seems to be a word which is ever prevalent. And the cluster, in a sense, is based on a kind of an American principle where buildings are brought together to give you this density. But when you go and you look at the situation in Elephant and Castle, and you actually ask yourself, is a cluster going to be worse than one? It's very hard to say that it will be. So I just want to try to make a conclusion now. So we have over 240 towers at present at different stages in planning. They reveal basically the values that we bring to our city. They ignore many of the values that are the basis of a civilized city. A civilized city wants to have integration. We want diversity. We want people to be able to exchange and transact. And we don't want unequal cities We know now that the research in England has shown that London is a city where there is huge amounts of growing inequality, the highest in Europe, I understand. So these towers at the moment, I would say, stand, and they stand for these this kind of legislation and this laissez-faire approach. We are also not supporting, through any of our planning, through any of our tax regimes, actively supporting sustainable development. If you build these towers, you don't pay 20% on your VAT. If you work on sustainable architecture and you try to renew the fabric of the existing communities, you'll be paying that. So I think the other thing is we have to ensure that planning processes are communicated in a clear way to local communities. They're not. The fact that we have to find out about these towers in this way is unacceptable. So, develop a spatial plan for the future of the city and communicate it with the citizens and look to re-establish some proper values for a civilised city. I rest my case.
All right. Lots of food for thought there from Mary Jane. So we've had some really very different takes on the questions that we're addressing here this evening, from Peter Rees and Mary Jane Rooney, from Peter's comments about how tall buildings symbolise architects masturbating, to Mary Jane's comments about how they symbolise inequality and foster segregation. So a whole lot of different things under discussion already, and I hope that you've started to get your own thoughts together for the questions that we have to come. I'm now going to introduce Paul Finch. Paul Finch is our third speaker for the evening. Paul Finch has been described as the godfather of architectural journalism. He has, over time, edited almost everything that there is to edit in architectural journalism and criticism, having held also many key roles, such as the chair of the Commission for Architecture and the Built Environment, and also the 2012 London Olympics Design Review Panel. He's also seen as a global authority on almost everything to do with architecture, and it's no surprise then that he is Programme Director of the World Architecture Festival. Paul Finch.
Matthew, thank you for that. Well, at the start of the evening, I was slightly nervous that the speakers might all end up kind of agreeing with each other. We think that maybe height was okay, but there were a few problems. But having heard the first two speakers, ladies and gentlemen, I have to say I disagree with almost everything they said. You've heard from Peter Rees that almost every tower in London is a nightmare except the ones that he was responsible for. And you've heard from Mary Jane an extraordinary display of architectural determinism, that it's towers themselves and height which are responsible for everything from the lack of governance in the city to the fact that people quite like coming to live in London if they've got a few pence to rub together. And I keep thinking to myself, you know, these towers, they're so bad, but in the words of the song, why does it feel so good? I mean, from the account you've been given, these ghastly, harmful things that are wrecking our city, that's why so many people are leaving. But funny enough, they're not, are they? London's just hit a record population. People love it. Now, we don't know why people like tall buildings, but they do. It's a bit of a mystery because we all know from kind of the 1960s onwards and the Leslie Martin Centre, height doesn't mean density. You can do nice 12-storey buildings. You don't have to have one of those awful tower things, and you can get the same sort of density. So how is it that so many people want to live in these towers? There's always a queue for apartments in the Barbican. Why is it that international companies wish to locate themselves, either their whole organisation or bits of it, in some of the magnificent buildings that we see in the City of London? Well, I'm not a psychologist and I can't tell you that, but what I can say is that when so many people are voting with their feet, it's rather curious that there's always a kind of little Guardianista cadre in the background saying it's all ruinous, it's going to kill us, it's all dreadful, this is completely novel. Let me tell you something. In the year 2000, there are about 230 tall buildings in London, and by tall, I mean 12 stories or more, because in London, unlike Manhattan, if you're at 12 stories, unless you're right in the middle of a cluster in the city, you can see right across London. And we forget that until very recently, the idea of height in this city was really of kind of village proportions. In 1962, Sir Hugh Casson, architect, Royal Fine Art Commissioner, later become president of the Royal Academy, said that he thought that height in London generally should be restricted to about, I've got the figure here, 30 metres he thought was about right. In London, that was a tall building. Outside London, in the provinces, he thought that 18 metres was about the sort of measurement that we would regard as being high. Well, even as he was saying that, the local authority tower blocks were springing up all over London. And what you'll never hear from the left liberal consensus that have got a big problem with height is that they were bad. Oh no, they were good, ladies and gentlemen, because they were for poor people. So height's okay when it's for poor people, but if it's for Malaysians or Londoners who just fancy living somewhere tall so they could look out over Stratford, for reasons that escape me, somehow this is evil and perverted. And what that means is, because they're not local authorities putting up these buildings, they're, oh my God, developers. What a hideous idea. People who believe in the private rented sector, there's something wrong with them. They're harmful. They're a conspiracy against the public. So it's the old British thing, you know, 2 legs bad, 4 legs good, or whichever way round it is. And you have to constantly adjust the argument. So if you say, you know what, we're going to do this 42-storey social housing block, instead of saying, that's great, people say, what about the lifts? You say, well, actually, the lifts are going to be paid for by blah, 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 but it's already too late. By definition, it's bad, especially if it hasn't been built, constructed and designed by the London Borough of Southwark or some equivalent body. And of course, the notion that the Elephant and Castle is being ruined by the demolition of actually some pretty tall buildings on social estates that were monocultural ghettos and weren't working is a bit of an embarrassment for all concerned. So what happens is, instead of welcoming the fact that the most exciting regeneration projects for 50 years are happening within yards of this building, there's this constant griping about a building because its windmills don't work. You know why they put those in? Because Ken Livingstone wanted 20% of energy generated by tall buildings actually on site. And it was a kind of slightly perverse response, you might say, and it didn't work. But let me say this, it was an early example of something, and in an academic institution, how about this for a motto? Better a fertile error than a sterile accuracy. And the problem with all those tall buildings created by the local authority section in the 50s and 60s, with the noblest of motives, which was to house the people who they were responsible for housing, I would say, in a sense, they were the sterile accuracies. And I don't even say that they were all bad either. And actually, most of them haven't been demolished. They're still with us. So we get these this short talk really in my mind, the title was Myths, Lies and Stereotypes. And almost everything you've heard about this evening about tall buildings is it's true and half true. The question of identity, for instance. Yes, of course, tall buildings create an identity, and developers know it. That's why the first building at Canary Wharf, really to get public attention, was Cesar Pelle's copy of his building at Battery Park City. Oh, how naughty, he copied a building he'd done somewhere else. That, ladies and gentlemen, generally speaking, is the history of architecture. And actually, repetition needn't be a bad thing. Look at that wonderful frontage in San Marco in Venice. It just goes on and on, the same thing, and it's fabulous. And under certain lighting conditions, you can say the same about certain tall buildings. Of course, tall buildings give identity. It's all very well for people to be snooty about the charm, looking at it from the City of London. I mean, it was an embarrassment to the City of London because it was actually a reminder that London Bridge was the origin of London. That's where the Romans came, and that's where the crossing came. And why shouldn't one of the greatest transport interchanges in Europe, that's to say London Bridge, considerably more significant than any station in the City of London, why shouldn't that have as its identity and marker the tallest building in the country? What's wrong with that? And the great triumph of what Piano did at London Bridge was to help to resolve the disastrous below ground condition of the transport interchange. And I think you have to see these huge tower projects at their best, which I think that is a good one, as comprehensive development in the best sense. It's not just about letting people get views and having an expensive hotel. It's all about dealing with a transport interchange which carries far more passengers than Heathrow in any given year, and trying to make their journey more agreeable. And anyone who said, remember what it was like beforehand. I used to use that route every day. Remember that dismal, ghastly, I think it was T.P. Bennett, boring brown building that used to be on that site, and the horrible boroughs you had to go through to get on a train. Actually, by comparison, it's rather marvellous now, and if you haven't been there, I commend it to you. But it's not just identity, ladies and gentlemen. I think we dealt with the question about height equaling density. Of course, although it's true that tall buildings don't necessarily mean density unless you do a sort of Hong Kong model where they're bang next to each other, which is not our way. But sometimes it is true. Now, Peter's Patch, let's say the area which includes the Gherkin, the CU Tower, or Aviva Tower, which is about to be replaced by the tallest building in that cluster of buildings, the Helter Skelter, and a couple of others, the Cheese Grater and a couple of others that are all happening on that patch. Do you know what that is? Very significant density, and you couldn't get that density building 12-storey buildings. You'd have to take a huge swathe of City of London land to get the density they're getting there. Is the density desirable? Well, why don't you try asking the 6,000 or 7,000 people who are going to be occupying those office buildings, which are being designed to a far superior standard in some cases to anything I think we may have seen in Europe, let alone London. It can be good. It doesn't necessarily mean it will be good everywhere, but that's not an argument against tall buildings, and it's not an argument against height. It's an argument about poverty of design, poverty of client imagination, and a weak planning system. Height kills heritage. We haven't heard that one this evening, except in the sense that we regard the skyline as part of our heritage. But of course, the notion of the skyline is kind of non-existent until there's something there. I mean, it's the Dome of St. Paul's that makes the skyline. And actually, as Hayes Davidson have proved on many occasions, most Londoners, when faced with entirely artificial views of the skyline that he mocks up, have no idea whether it's real or it isn't. He plays this parlour game of moving the blocks around, and people just don't know, because very few people spend their time as sort of English heritage ciphers going up to Parliament Hill Fields in order to be upset by what they see before them. It's easier to be upset by those dozy 2D montage images that the enemies of height always bring out at public inquiries. And when you point out to them, you do realise this isn't what it's going to look like. And then they say, oh yes, it is. It's been GIS certified and they're absolutely correct views. And you say, excuse me, what we're looking at is a document here. In real life, it's real size. And you get foreground and background and lighting conditions. And by the way, if you don't like it, you can look at something else. And unlike the enemies of height, who are in this kind of fixed Prince Charles, feet in concrete, my God, my Canaletto view's being destroyed. Actually, what you're doing is walking across the bridge to go and get a beer somewhere. That is ordinary life, and the point about cities is not about David Harvey's thing about everybody's got the rights to go around the community centre ranting on, and then nothing happens till you have an election, and then you don't like the politicians, etc., etc. Do you know what the great thing about cities is? Firstly, you can come and go. It's movement. And the thing about architecture in the city is that from every angle, from every perspective, it constantly changes, and that's as true of tall buildings as any other sort of building. So then the next thing you have to come to is that actually towers are horrible. Now, towers can be horrible, but I would argue it's not the height. The reason that towers don't work in the city is all about the base of the tower. Now, Peter spent a huge amount of time at the City of London, not just dealing with the ground plane around towers, but with the ground plane generally, the pocket parks, the little piazzas. Do you know, he made a brilliant point about this, and because it's in favour of height, he hasn't made it this evening, so I'll make it for you, Peter. People say, that walkie-talkie, how greedy is that? And it gets bigger at the top. How dare he? No one's ever done that before. Well, actually they have, because Ernesto Rogers did it at the Torre Velasquez in Milan many decades ago. But in modern times, and for a speculative commercial building, how dare he make it bigger at the top? It's not fair. He's taking our sky away. As a matter of fact, if you look at the site area, all he's done is he could have put a Mars bar on there, and what he's done, he's taken space out so that at the base he doesn't use the whole site, and that's why you get a pocket piazza there, and that's why the experience of walking around that building is 1,000% better than it was with that dumb old tall block, admittedly a tall block, that was there before. So let's knock it in a dishonest way. And the other thing about that, can you believe this? I read the Sunday Times report on this with mounting disbelief. They quoted a woman who'd been to the Sky Park at the top of this Vignoli Tower, and she said, it's not much of a park, there's no grass in there. I mean, you know, this is the top of a 50-storey building. What on earth did she think was going to happen? What else did she think was going to be? Full-size trees? I mean, it's a really bizarre idea. Let me put it to you. Sorry. So what happens is, here's the line. Because we hate developers, and because we hate this clever clogs architect who did something no one else had thought of, which was giving people more space at the top than at the bottom because it's better space and the views are better. So that's completely unacceptable. And he's American and South American as well. So it gets worse and worse, and they're horrible developers. So this public space they put at the top is not really public. Well, it's true in the sense that you can't just walk onto it like walking into Burgess Park. How could it be anything else? But then the sniping starts. I had to book to go up there. Oh, well, what a surprise. I had to produce ID to prove I was the person that I said I was when I made the booking. I mean, do these people ever go to the cinema or collect anything, you know, from Waitrose? You know, it's a click and collect culture, ladies and gentlemen. And don't use that against me. It was ironic. It was said in an ironic postmodern sort of way. And then the next thing they say, and I had to go through security to get up there. And I had to give 3 days' notice, and you can't go on Saturday. Moan, 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 moan. Meanwhile, anyone with half a brain who wants to go and look at it just books. They take their bus pass and whatever they've got. They go up there, they get these fabulous views. You don't have to look at the building if you don't like it, because you're in it. You get fabulous views of everything south of the river, including very wonderful views of the Shard, of course. And this is a public benefit. And actually, what's wrong with that? Instead of knocking it, we should welcome it. Do you know what the City Corporation are doing on the back of this? Because under this regime, that was insisted on as part of the planning game. And, now the city's extending this. Public rooms at the top of all these new tall office buildings that are going up in the city. It will be a great public benefit, and why not? And just a couple of final points. Tower blocks produce criminals. Let me tell you, ladies and gentlemen, the Craig twins were brought up in impeccable low-rise terraced housing by their auntie Dolly. It didn't stop them in later life nailing their opponents to the floorboards No doubt a hymn to the joys of traditional construction. My only worry about tall buildings, and this would be my last kind of myth or lie, is that we've got a tall buildings policy. We've got a kind of set of quite apologetic technical aspirations tied up in a piece of string whose length has yet to be determined. We don't really have a proper tall buildings policy, which will be saying quality, 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 quasi-public space at the top, beautiful brown plain at the bottom, and let's make London as well known for its tall buildings as it is, probably from Peter's point of view, for sex, drugs and rock and roll. Thank you.
Right, well, thank you very, very much for that from our three speakers. From Paul there, I'm not even going to try to come up with some summary comments about that, except quality, quality, quality as part of the policy we should be looking at is perhaps an interesting point of departure. We had very different approaches from our speakers, and what it says in the program at this point is I'm supposed to ask them some probing questions and try to read back to you some of the themes that have come up. I think one of the themes that has come up very strongly across all of the speakers has been this theme of identity, how these tall buildings represent and raise identity questions for us, and that might be a theme that speakers might want to pick up on, including both of our student speakers who kicked off tonight, whether it's to do with phallic symbols, spiritual, celestial markers, monuments to money. These tall buildings seem to mean something to us. And then there are the social issues. Do tall buildings raise questions of inequality? Are they disrespectful to society? Do they, in fact, create social harm in some ways? And how do they relate to the planning and bigger spatial strategic issues? Should tall buildings be in special islands of extra density? Should there be more interaction between different scales, and is there something about local authority control and control at a wider scale? So I think in order to maybe crystallize some of these questions, there were some issues that that really only one of our speakers didn't pick up on very directly, although he made a few comments about, I'm not going to start with that one because Paul has just said a lot to us. So rather I'm going to ask Mary Jane to perhaps respond initially to any of those points she would like to, and also to this question I'd like to ask, which is that we've heard some of these sob stories about how tall buildings are the enemy, they're not in keeping with the sort of touchy-feely social agenda that some of us who are softer-hearted and are kind to animals feel is right for parts of the city. But let's face it, in the past, blighted neighbourhoods such as Elephant and Castle, things haven't worked here. And as Monica was saying, some of these tall buildings are trying to bring some idea of progress. Tall, shiny towers have been synonymous with forward-looking architecture for as long as anyone can remember. Surely, if we're arguing against them so strongly, we are just suggesting a backward course. How do we reconcile those ideas of progress and the idea of those ideas of progress that are represented by these tall buildings, and the alternative, which is surely not going to work if you think of a low-rise future city in a place like London? So that question of if we are going to stand against tall buildings, are we not being a little bit backward-looking?
Okay, I'm happy to hand over. Okay. What makes us think that progress isn't an ideal in just the way that social justice has been? Why is progress necessarily a value which is going to be the primary value in the way that we make our cities? I'm not saying it can't be a value and it shouldn't be a value, but if finance and a kind of notion of progress become the only driver in the development of our cities, where does that leave all the rest of it? The stuff which is, I don't think it is the soft stuff. I think it's actually the pretty hard stuff. How do we house people? How do we provide a genuinely mixed society. We know that there is a problem in London with schools. We know that there are major issues which are really about increasing inequality. So my challenge really is to say to you all, it's okay, towers, high rise, glamour, fine. But if we are actually in complete dereliction of addressing some of these much more serious issues, they are just that. They're just the window dressing. We need to really think about what the city needs to develop, not just the City of London, but the whole city, the boroughs all together. So I don't think it's backward or soft to actually talk about some of these issues. I think housing, education, the state of our NHS, these kinds of things are an outcome, and they're an outcome of something which I'm saying is encapsulated in the tower. It's a value, just the same as any other value. If the towers consolidate finance and they stand for money, or they stand for progress, they can stand for other things. Other things can be put in their place. Are those two values, money and progress, the only values we need to apply to our society?
Thanks for that. Food for thought, and I think people will come back to that later. Peter, I'd like to ask you, I think you spoke in a way both for and against the motion in different ways, for the motion in some parts of the city and against it in others. But you are certainly very acquainted with also this movement towards thinking about how to move the public realm not only to the base of buildings, but also to the top. I wonder, with regard to the idea of what many people think of now as a bit of a public realm fantasy with regard to these tall buildings, if we'd begun to achieve the dream of public spaces 300 meters up in the air, would we not be feeling a little bit happier about it at this point? You can go up to the viewing platform at the top of the Shard for about £24.95 a ticket. I think it's £19.95 if you're a student, or they'll throw in a glass of champagne for a few pounds more. But does the walkie-talkie Sky Garden measure up to the height? To the hype? Where are the promised gardens? Where's the dignified, accessible public celebration of civic space that we should be seeing at the tops of these buildings? I think in a place like the Shard, which you have obviously set your sights against tonight, in a place like the Shard, what most people see is something that's expensive and exclusive and very convoluted to get up to. So the question is, if high-rise public space at the tops of these buildings is a representation of what the developers of these money-making megaliths are giving back, surely we've been duped. Have we not been sold a lie? Is there a different possible way of doing it?
Well, as I made clear, I hope, tall buildings are a last resort. You certainly shouldn't be building tall for the sake of it. It's not a good way of housing Londoners. The tall buildings that we're seeing going up across most of London at the moment are being built purely and simply to sell in Hong Kong for investment purposes, to be left empty. And this is true. In mainland China, if you buy an apartment, the minute you move into it, the value drops dramatically. It's like buying a new car. So when the Chinese buy a flat for investment purposes, they ask that the kitchen shouldn't be installed because that will date. And they wrap the door handles and the taps and all the chrome work in cling film to protect it from corrosion. And they walk away. I mean, I'm living on the 27th floor of the Heron in the city. And we tried to form a residents' association recently. We can't contact 25% of the owners because after 12 months of ownership, they haven't collected their keys. These flats are not for living in. And these tall buildings that are being designed for residential purposes are designed specifically to appeal to that market. They're being designed to be unlettable. They're being designed to be slums for rich people. You look at the area from Vauxhall to Battersea through Nine Elms. They're wedging buildings in like Victorian hulk strips pulled aground off the river. Now, it doesn't matter whether it's by Rogers or Geary or whoever it's designed by. It's just packed into the point. Can't make a community. There's only one thing that area lacks to be a proper ghost town, and that's tumbleweed blowing in the streets. They talk about the need for to extend the Northern Line to make it work. A single-decker bus every hour is more than enough for the number of people who are actually going to live there. And we're actually giving away large parts of London. Those areas used to be derelict land. Derelict land's wonderful, it's got potential. These developments have got no potential because they've been sold off on 100-year leases. They are locked in for 100 years and they cannot be good living communities. They're not designed to be. That's not what the product is for. Now, I don't blame the developers. These developments are 4 to 6 times more profitable than putting up an office block in the middle of the city. So why wouldn't you do that? Why wouldn't you throw the office tenants out of the King's Reach Tower, add 11 floors on the top and convert it to investment residential? Because it's going to make you a lot more money. I don't blame the local authorities, the boroughs, because, as we've heard, they need planning gain, their books don't balance. That's the only way they can achieve their housing targets, whether people live in them or not. And finally, if, like Lambeth, they do stand up and refuse St George's Tower at Vauxhall, what happens? A John Prescott or a Pickles stands up and approves it. So the mayor, Livingston, Johnson, nothing to choose between them. Prescott, Pickles, nothing to choose between them. They'll just rubber stamp anything that involves a tower crane because it must be good for the economy. Never mind what it's for. So it's the bad land use I'm against. Now, look at those buildings in the city. They were built because the city needed to house offices, to house jobs. The city has become the world centre of insurance. Most of those towers in the cluster of towers in the city are housing insurance companies. Aon, the Chicago insurance company, have moved their headquarters from Chicago to the cheese grater. W.R. Barclay from New York are building their own skyscraper called the Scalpel in the middle of the city. Those buildings are filling up even before they're finished, and they're being built by developers that are going to hang on to them for a long time to let them out. They're built in high quality materials because the developers want them to be cheap to maintain. You compare that with the residential product that's going up. It's built quickly and cheaply. They might engage a good architect to do the first design, but then they dumb it down in-house with Barclay Homes, in-house architects, strip all the good materials off, build it as cheaply and quickly as possible, and sell it to some poor sod in Hong Kong who doesn't understand about these things, who's then going to have the maintenance bill. So I'm not against the building tall if you've got no other option, but I don't think it's something that London needs as a universal solution. And as to the space on the top, if you're going to build tall because you need to, then I think it's the planner's job to try and get something back for the wider community. We've got 2 24-hour restaurants and a bar on top of the Heron Tower. Even the old Tower 42's got a cocktail bar at the top of it. All of the buildings that are coming through in the city have some leisure use on the top of the building, and where possible, public space like the one in the walkie-talkie. It's very interesting that the people who are panning the walkie-talkie are the architectural critics. The public who are getting to go up the building seem to think it's wonderful. I've been up 3 or 4 times myself and I enjoy going up there. You go up for the view. You don't go up to be in Kew Gardens. You can't create Kew Gardens in the top of a building. There are some gardens in there, but the main thing is to go up there to gossip, because London is about gossip. It doesn't matter whether it's the pub or the top of the walkie-talkie, we need places to gossip. What we don't need are dead ghost towns of investment property.
Thank you for that. Well, Paul, I'm just going to ask you very briefly to respond to a quick observation. We've had the comment that we must try not to blame the developers. We must try not to blame the local authorities. But I think in some ways, none of us have really answered to this question that I think Mary Jane asked quite eloquently. And that occurred to me at this time when, as Aaron was saying, we've got these tall money boxes being sold off in Singapore and Dubai and Cannes, and the sense of displacement and marginalisation in places like Stratford and Elephant and Castle. So if we're attracting all this inward investment and with fringe benefits that are supposed to be helping us rebuild the city, in whose image is this city being built? Who is this city for that's being built in these towers? And isn't it possible? Well, I'll let you answer that.
It's an interesting question. I mean, my objection in general to the tone of these arguments is that it's the towers that are causing it. I mean, they are simply an architectural representational consequence of decisions made by politicians and planners and landholders and all the rest of it. It has nothing to do with height. I mean, would we be happy if all the overseas investors were investing in 8-storey Marylebone mansion blocks? I mean, that would be okay, but somehow towers are naughty. And I do think there's something quite odd about this. And I think that people start looking at towers, and because they're unfamiliar, they go into spasm about it, and it's because they've all been brought up in suburban semis. I was brought up in apartments, so I was, you know, my very earliest years were in Eaton Square, 8 stories, then local authority housing in Pimlico, 8 to 10. Etc., etc. It's no big deal, but for a lot of people, you know, especially architectural critics, all brought up in Ealing, I mean, they see a tall building and all they see is money. Do you know what? You make money out of Marylebone mansion blocks. Check out the prices for the top floor of those. It's ridiculous, kind of moralistic twaddle. And I think, as far as the image of London is concerned, who's to say? Where are all those French people living? That's what I want to know. You know, London's now the 5th or 6th biggest French city. You know, it's approaching. Well, it can't be. There's too many of them. There's 400,000. They ain't in those tall towers. If you're looking around for somebody to blame for the housing shortage, why don't you blame all the French for nicking all the ordinary housing? I mean, it's preposterous. The image of London, if we want London to be a 10 million and rising and 12 million and all the rest of it, and if we want to welcome everyone from the world to come and live here, then the image of London, guess what, is going to change. And by the way, when London was at its richest and most powerful as an empire, do you think the people who built all those bank buildings in the city gave a tuppenny stuff about, you know, ordinary housing in Manchester? Of course they didn't. They lived or died by the market, and the Malaysian investment thing is the market at work. If we don't want overseas people owning houses here, we can just do what the Germans or the Swiss do, make it illegal. Produce your passport or you can't buy. Now, if that's what we want to do, that's our choice. But for God's sake, don't bring tall buildings into it. It's an irrelevance.
Thanks very much. I'm going to throw this open to the floor now. I think what I'll do is remain up here. So if you have a question, just put your hand up. And what we'll do is I'd like it very much if you could say who you are when the mic gets to you. We have roving mics, do we? Yes, we do. Oh, this is it. We have a roving mic. Say who you are and if you represent a company or if you're a student, where you are from. We had a question over there, 2 questions over there. So perhaps you, sir, and then Madam after you.
I'm Gavin Lowndes. I'm Borough Architect of Ealing and interested in Paul Finch and his liberal right agenda, giving a kicking to local authorities already on their knees for reasons probably we all know about. What was interesting is that this town that I sort of work with is not full of architectural journalists, it's communities. And the thing that has changed the community without any doubt at all is the rezoning, and Ealing is like a lot of parts of London about to change radically in terms of land values as a result of Crossrail, and the investment that's taking place in Ealing at the moment is all about the overseas market, keeping buildings empty. And I remember reading almost as a student, almost unbelievably, of the story that Peter has mentioned in Roman Koolhaas's book on the Pearl River Delta, and the idea that you could build a skyscraper, an enormous building, with absolutely no intention whatsoever of ever occupying. And in the case in Ealing, I don't even think the taps are being cling filmed, simply because the buildings that are being built there now have a value which will be incomparably increased as a result of infrastructure which, dare I say it, the ratepayer and the people of Ealing are paying for. What I'd like Paul to do is to think what it would be like, not to do necessarily with tall buildings, but the developments that are being castigated in this debate. How is it possible to ally overseas investment with guaranteeing that a community is enhanced by the developments, tall or otherwise?
Well, single buildings don't make communities. There are all sorts of reasons why communities are broken up in London, you know, which we don't have time to go into now, but I don't think it's got anything at all to do with architecture. My point is simply this. the only way that you can house your population satisfactorily, and the only way that you can keep communities together, which means building homes so that people who grow up in an area can afford to buy or rent in the area where they grew up, is to build plenty of it. This has been a political failure, and I do not blame local authorities for this at all as organisations, although I think some of their politicians have been as bad as the national politicians, who I chiefly blame. And I mainly blame Conservatives, but they've been followed on equally badly by Labour. So it's like that thing, if you ask, right, name the last 3 ministers of housing, you know, it's a joke question. You're lucky if you can name the present one. Why isn't a housing minister in the cabinet? You know, why isn't there a minister of construction in the cabinet? 10% of Britain's GDP, they don't even get a cabinet place. It's a joke. And I think that if you build out, do you know what? All those empty towers on Nine Elms, do you know something? There is no community on that area where they're building those towers. No one lives there. And they haven't lived there, you know, for as long as anyone can remember. Yes, there are communities on the other side of Wandsworth Road, and there are a few people on Nine Elms Lane. There are people with a view of the dog zone. The point about Stratford and Nine Elms, they were desert land, as Peter said. It was derelict land. There weren't any communities there. You're not destroying communities by doing that. It's one of my lies, as opposed to a myth. And what you have to keep doing is building for people in the areas that are available. There is no shortage of land in London to build housing for everybody. It's just, that is an absolute lie. The Greenbelt thing is nonsense. But you have to have political direction about this. And once we swapped a building policy for a fiscal redistribution policy where you let council tenants enjoy some benefits of paying rent for years and years and years and become a little bit more like the private sector. What did we do? We didn't build any substitute homes, and we're still running that policy out. And my rule is this: the more speeches you hear from Boris Johnson and David Luntz and the people who are supposed to be running it in Whitehall about the housing shortage, it's in inverse proportion to the number of homes they're actually delivering this year. Not starting, not talking about starting, not going in for planning, actually building and completing. And like any market, if you build enough and satisfy demand, it doesn't matter if there are some empty ones. It's called a vacancy rate. And that's the difference between having a market where people have got a bit of choice and a market where they've got none, where all that happens is either the office rents go sky high or, as in London now, the prices become completely unachievable.
Yeah, but Paul, they haven't got a choice, because what's going up is simply driving up the prices with a product that's being left empty. So not only are the ones that are going up not available to people because they're being sold in Hong Kong purely for investment and aren't designed for real people, but equally they're pushing up the price of all the rest of London housing and making it even less affordable.
Actually, that's not true either, because actually, first, we haven't built enough, and secondly, the question of mortgage availability, it's not as though there isn't any money available. Look what we've lent to, you know, the semi-state-owned banks. I mean, this is a three-part question, isn't it? One is construction and capacity. Another is land and land availability. And why are we still sitting on vast amounts of public sector land in London, for which local authorities are on the hook, because if they don't sell it for the maximum possible price, the borough treasurer will be jailed. It's a slight exaggeration, but you know, well, they've got to max out, or they've got to do JVs.
Let's get some more people involved in this, because there are a few more questions to go. There's a woman in the second row over there had a question. Thanks.
Adele Morris, I'm an alumni. I'm a councillor in the London Borough of Southwark. I sit on the planning committee, and I'm also the ward member for the ward in which we are sitting. It's a real problem that in Southwark, actually. The towers have created a monster. They are being slipped in all over the place because architects think it will be lovely to have their mark on every street corner. In this ward, it's about 50% affordable social housing, historically, traditionally. This is the poor part of London. It's where poor people have lived for generations, and suddenly they can't live here anymore. At the Elephant and Castle at Lend-Lease, the Lend-Lease development, I think on the first floor of one of the developments, so not in a tower, a one-bedroom flat in Trafalgar Place is £465,000. My daughter is 21. She's earning a minimum wage. where is she going to get an £80,000 deposit for them to ever get a mortgage on a property like that? People are being forced out of London, and we need people on minimum wage, because actually somebody has got to work in all the service industries that are coming, all the hotels, all the cafes, the bars that are being created as part of all this, and we're not making housing for them. And the problem with these developments, actually I don't have a problem with towers as such. What I have a problem with is the towers that are built to a certain specification which only appeals to the overseas investor. It's not meeting the 42,000 homes a year that the London plan has identified, because it's not housing people. My question is, what can you, as a school of architecture, do to encourage your architects to look at it from the bottom up and look at the community? I think the very first speaker said London is all about change. Actually, I disagreed. London is about people. People have lived in London and been living in London, and generations have brought up their families in London, and those people now are being written out by these developments. So what can you, as a School of Architecture, do?
Thanks very much. I'd like to great question there. We've got Mary Jane and Peter representing different schools of architecture, so I'd like to give them both a turn to make a brief response to that, and then we have some other questions on this side. So Mary Jane.
Okay, you probably heard from my presentation that the school has been involved in working in this area. We've done work on the Walworth Road, we've done work on the North Peckham, we've also looked at the Haygate and the Aylesbury, so we're very, very familiar with what's happening. And I think a regeneration site like Elephant and Castle provides an incredible environment for looking at what is going on in the city and for studying these kind of forces. It's not the architects that actually are just trying to do towers and have a really great time. Architects, of course, are part of an economy. We're quite low in the chain at the moment, and effectively, it is actually the government policy and Southwark's own policy, I would argue, that has generated the situation that we see currently at Elephant and Castle. And it's understandable, because profit is always going to seek the highest return unless we do something about that, unless we try and find a way of saying that these other values must be incorporated into our city plans and our culture and organisation and values. If it's only money, you are going to see people being driven out further and further. And that's what happens in Chinese cities. They go right out to the outer ring. A little piece of research which was done recently in London has discovered that those that live furthest out are earning less money than anyone else. So they have to travel back in, go back out, and they're earning less than the minimum wage in many cases. And that's a pretty shitty state of affairs, isn't it? Corey?
Thanks very much. Thank you. And Peter?
I think the first thing we've got to do with our architectural students is to reintroduce them to the sense of place. When I was created a professor, I thought I'd better come up with a definition, because you have to have definitions when you're a professor. So as a professor of places, I came up with a definition that a place is a space plus people. It doesn't necessarily involve architecture even. And it's not architects or planners who create places, it is people who create places. It's where they choose to gossip. So if you create a space of the right proportions, with the right mixture of uses around it, that's accessible and permeable, people will go there, even if it's porter cabins that you have around it. Now, it's very nice to have architecture as well, because that's putting the icing on. But if you've got a rotten cake, there's no point in icing it. So let's get the ingredients of the cake right first, working with the community to find out what they need, and then put the icing, put the architecture on around that. So I think there's great scope for architects and planners and the young people to come into the profession and work directly with the community. I think, with respect to yourself, we've got to depoliticise planning. And I don't mean taking councillors away, because local councillors play a very important role at the grassroots. But once you get up to the Mayor of London's level, there's nothing to choose between what Ken Livingstone did or what Boris is doing, or between the Conservative or the Labour governments. They just want big, showy projects. They want things that are there for vanity purposes more than for anything else. And they don't want to come down to the grassroots and actually understand these basic philosophies. So I think it's for the next generation of the profession to reconnect with the communities and start delivering what the community need, being part of the community, living in that community.
Thanks very much. We have a question here at the front.
I work for the NCE. I was just kind of wondering, what's the alternative? If you're building, if you don't build tall buildings, what do you do? And why has the government chosen this as opposed to building on the flat ground? And do you think that kind of by building more tall buildings, the kind of the magic for the overseas investors will go away, and therefore the prices will actually drop because you'll become more? I think that Paul's already touched on that as well. And also, just one kind of point on that, in terms of kind of people with building social houses versus the other kind of end of the market, I kind of very much see social housing as the people on the kind of the lists and the minimum wage, but actually for people like me, well, I can't afford it. And that's a kind of an observation which always very much irritates me, because everybody always talks about the social housing or the other housing and people in the middle. Anyway, question.
I'd like to see if anybody else has any questions, because if we can take in a few more questions and comments, it would be good to get them in. We've got someone right at the back, someone over here. Maybe take a couple of these questions while I'll get some brief comments from the speakers. Anybody want to pick up on any of the issues that have been raised?
The government has no policies to promote tall buildings or anything else. I mean, it's a kind of laissez-faire system. If you want to propose a 12-storey building, fine. It's up to you. You have a go. I think that people have short memories, and at the end of the 1970s, the GLC planners were quite worried about housing in London, not because there wasn't enough of it, because there was too much, and they thought that the oversupply was going to create sort of squats and sort of the wrong ghettos where people were sort of just going into empty property and living rent-free on a big scale. Well, that didn't last very long, but the assumption that what we've got at the moment lasts forever, I think, is equally unwise. And I think the whole idea that it's developments that cause this problem is a fantasy. It's the lack of construction that's caused our housing problem. And of course, in Southwark's case, you start knocking down things after 30 years on a mass scale. It does terrible things to your net completion rate, and you end up with a really serious problem. And let me just say this, we have completely failed to build enough homes for Londoners. We have known since the London Underground strategy planners did the analysis of, I think, the 1990 census, that central London, but inner London, was repopulating after 50 years of exodus to Essex and further afield. Why? Essentially because of EU inward migration. It's no mystery. Now, London has taken the vast bulk of, its population's increased by, I don't know, the best part of 2 million over the last 10 years when Labour finally owned up to the figures. You cannot just rehouse or house that number of people without immense social stresses. And my complaint about the national politicians, they knew this was happening and they didn't do anything about it. They pretended it wasn't happening. They didn't have a construction policy. They didn't have a housing policy. And even Gordon Brown in the end said we need more council housing, a point with which I profoundly agree. I mean, OK, dress it up with some sort of different name because, that's what you have to do these days. But, if you don't do that, then you've created a problem at the bottom. If there's a problem at the bottom, it becomes a problem for the middle. So for me, it's just supply, supply, supply. And in a sense, the architectural form is an irrelevance. An architect should just design good stuff.
Let's get the question from the chap at the back there. And then I'd like to, I don't know where Rishi is, but get 2 or more questions in before we close, because then we're going to go to networking. So chap at the back, yes.
4 buildings in London that I really enjoy looking at, and it doesn't depend upon the light conditions, the time of day, the weather, the time of year. And there's some low-rise buildings that I really hate looking at. I think they're disasters. And the thing is, I find the low-rise buildings that I hate looking at, maybe I pass them in the car once a year, once every 6 months, they don't really bother me. However, when I look at that building, whatever the light conditions, whatever the time of year, I can't enjoy looking at it. And the trouble is, I'm a South Londoner, and I see it probably every day. And the fact is, I was going to say it's depressing. It's not really depressing. I think as a Londoner born and bred, I find that kind of thing embarrassing. Similarly with the rubbish that's on the south side of Vauxhall Bridge. And so I therefore asked the question on that basis: are they a mistake?
Can we just go directly to the next question? It was over here. Yes, this chap on the 4 rows down. Don't kill yourself walking down these treacherous stairs.
Hi, my name's David. I'm a postgrad building science student at this university. I wanted to pick up on a couple of things Paul said, really. Firstly, I agree with a lot of what he said in terms of the need for tall buildings. You know, we're an increasingly urban society on a very small island, and people have to live somewhere, so upwards is often the only option. I did want to say they use the term, I think, sterile monoculturalism when talking about Haygate Estate. There's a lot of danger, firstly, the way we're doing this, of going the other way in terms of sterile monoculturalism, in excluding normal people, really normal wage earners, from the estates that they're replacing. And also the reference you made to better a fertile error than a sterile accuracy. This development of this scale provides an opportunity for, I think, truly sustainable development, sustainable communities. So is it not true that we don't have the luxury of getting this wrong on a vast scale? We need to do it correct. We need to do it right first time in many ways.
Right up at the back there, all the way over, and I think that's going to be our final question before we have some closing announcements, and then there'll be drinks and lots of time for chat upstairs. So this is not the end of the conversation.
I'm Michael, an architectural enthusiast, to term myself. I just wanted to pick up on the point of inequality, that tall buildings can be used for the opposite, to increase the diversity of a neighbourhood. So if you take, for example, this unattractive building that was built in Elephant and Castle, before that was built, there's probably very few affluent people that lived in Elephant and Castle at that time. You plant that in, and you've got 700 wealthy people there who are now paying council tax, who are now in that area, who can take an interest in the local affairs that wouldn't have otherwise. And if they're all living in, say, Westminster, paying the lowest council tax in the country, that's not doing the rest of London any good.
Thanks for that. So I'm going to invite each of the speakers now to respond to any or all of those questions, and just to have some closing remarks. Let's start with Peter.
If those flats that are being put up were all occupied, I wouldn't mind whether it was people from other countries that were buying them. I wouldn't mind where the money was coming from, because they'd be being used. They'd be something that London needed. And as you say, they'd be benefiting the local community, paying their taxes and using the local facilities. What upsets me is that they're left empty and they don't support any of the local facilities, they don't use the local shops, and they sterilise the area and damage existing communities. I think that the thing we've got to rediscover is the importance of rented property. If you look at Paris or Berlin or Vienna, most people rent their homes. But successive US and British governments of all complexions have stigmatised rented housing. They've made people feel that if they didn't own their own home, they weren't true stakeholders in society. The banks invented a wonderful way of lending money to people who couldn't afford to pay it back, and we all know where that ended, in the banking crash. But if we can get back to good quality rented housing, one of the most sought after areas of London is Marylebone. You can't buy a flat in Marylebone. They're all owned by the Howard Walden estate that manage that area, choose the shops in Marylebone High Street, keep it up to a very high standard, and rent out the flats to people. There isn't much vacancy there because, by and large, people don't rent a flat and then not live in it. So it's a much more efficient method of land use. And I think if we could do that, then we'd be in the position the Germans are in, where instead of tying up all your capital in mortgages, that money would be available for consumption. And that's one of the reasons why German industry is in a much better state than ours. But when George Osborne goes round the world claiming that this country is growing by 3% per annum, he's talking crap, because all that's happening is that house prices are going up by 3% per annum. So that's the miracle he wants, regardless of the consequences.
Thanks very much. I'm going to ask Paul to speak next and leave the very last word to Mary Jane.
Yeah, pepper potting, I like it. I think that all the affordable element, and I believe this should have happened at One Hyde Park, would have been a far more interesting building. Well, let's put it this way. There is an embarrassment, let's face it, about the idea of social mix in the 21st century, and in fact, pretty much in the post-war period in the last century, which is that where you had areas where you had a real social mix, it was because the poor people were servants. And we like watching downturn, but we ain't going to kind of live like that anymore. And as a consequence, we haven't discovered a way of actually creating in new places the sort of mix that used to be commonplace in London, and I think that's a real problem. And I like the idea of affordable going into the buildings. And you know what? The developers will kick and scream about it. The housing associations say we'd rather have the block that we can manage. Well, I say nuts to that. That actually that is a good way to do it. I mean, on the point of empty property, I'm a big fan of the rating system. I would introduce a penal rate for properties that were left empty, and the more valuable the property was, the bigger the rate. You don't need a mansion tax, though. That, you know, that's a piece of New Labour bullshit. You just have another grading on your thing, which is X on the scale. You got X is empty property, and whack the rate, and if that doesn't work, whack it up some more. And it's kind of, you know, in the end, do you know how stingy rich people are? They'll scream and shout about empty rates, but I said, well, you know, that's the way we do it. If you don't like it, sell up and move somewhere else. And I think the last thing, I mean, it has to be said, yes, of course, there are some dogs that are tall buildings in London, and they are. Hugh Casson, to finish with another remark of his, he said the least an architect can do for his fellow citizens, that if he is going to build a tall building, to make it a good one, because more people can see it. I think the problem about really ugly buildings is that that's the place that you want a cluster. And as a final point, I think I think that you could say the problem, our real problem, a fundamental problem about our tall buildings problem in London is this: the only certainty is where you can't build, which is you can't build in the St Paul's sightline. That's it. Everywhere else you can have a punt. And what we need to do is to say we're going to identify the areas that make sense because of the transport, etc., 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 and have a proper policy instead of this piece of nonsense where anybody with a tall tower model and a check for Crossrail can do what the hell they like.
Thank you. And finally, Mary Jane.
Okay. I think it's all got to be, I mean, the importance we've got is that the city addresses the real issues. And mixed tenure, I totally support that. I think we've got to have cities where we have a mixture of people. We've got to find ways of not just leaving it to the market, because I don't think the market can decide. I think this means that probably as a city grows in complexity, there needs to be more intervention. And that intervention has to come from both government, councils, and of course the people that live in the city. So we can't just leave it all up to the market. We can't just let things happen. London developed in that way. We're now facing a significant challenge where there's going to be up to 10 million people living in the city. We need to plan for that, and we need to think about planning schools, hospitals, housing for the people that will live in the city.
So, right at the beginning of this evening, Scott asked you to raise your hands if you were for or against the motion. So I think we're going to try that again and see if people have changed their minds. I think we've had some very compelling and interesting arguments either way. So please raise your hand if you think London doesn't need any more tall buildings. I think we've even lost some people. And please raise your hand if you... Okay. Scott, would you like to ask the same question you asked before?
So the question was, if you are for tall buildings, raise your hand. If after these compelling arguments you are against tall buildings, raise your hand.
Okay, excellent. Well, but definitely I think what we're seeing is that a lot of people maybe are hearing that these arguments for qualifying what tall buildings mean are important. Before you get up to leave, I've got a couple of final things to say. Firstly, we need to thank everybody at the LSBU Alumni Association, especially Rees, who put this evening together. I know that some of you know this, but the LSBU Alumni Association is the free professional network that all students will automatically become a member of once they graduate, and it offers a wide range of benefits and services, including invitations, but you are welcome to be as active as you can be once you graduate. Please take this opportunity afterwards upstairs to meet one another. I'd also very much like to invite and ask any alumni or professionals or employers who are here to talk to members of the Alumni Association, or to talk to Mary Jane or any other architecture and built environment staff members. If you have the possibility of work placements, we have a big program of mentoring that takes place in architecture, which is run in partnership with the Alumni Office and the RIBA, which happens in January and May. And if you think that there might be some involvement from your office to engage with third-year students for mentoring and shadowing, we'd really love to hear from you to get involved in that program. If you have some ideas about that, you should talk to Kirsty Palmer, who is the LSBU Employment Officer, or Mary Jane Rooney, or Carla James. And finally, not entirely finally, I'd like to thank all of our speakers, and very finally, I'd like to invite you all to come upstairs and have a drink and some snacks with us afterwards. So thank you very much.